Before we can get into developing, we have to make sure we are all set on the tools needed throughout this course. First, you will need a Salesforce org. You can get one by signing up for a developer org through developer.salesforce.com/signup, and then fill out all the information that's needed, and then you can sign up and get a developer org. I already have one, so I'm not going to be doing it again. However, this is one way. The other way is by going through Trailhead. Trailhead, if you haven't heard of it, is used for Salesforce training, and there's a bunch of different modules and badges, and it's all gamified, and you can kind of compete and get scores through going through a bunch of trails. You can either sign up, or if you already have one, log in, and then from there you can create a playground, and then that playground can be used for the developer org. Once we have that, we're going to need either a text editor or an IDE. One IDE that we can use, so I'm in my developer org right now. We can use Salesforce has an IDE that's already fully integrated. That's their own IDE called Developer Console. You can go to there by getting to the gear and then clicking on to Developer Console. And then from there, once that opens up, you can use this to go through the course. I will be using something different. I'll be using Visual Studio Code. But first I wanted to go through Developer Console a little, just so that way you know a different way to go through the course without having to download Visual Studio Code. First, what we'd be doing is a lot of the beginning we would just be running and executing in Anonymous Window. Now, Anonymous Window is where you can execute any line of code. You can either execute all of it or execute just whatever is highlighted, and then you can open your log. When I go through Visual Studio Code, I'll be kind of going through the logs within the terminal. So you'll see that as an output, but it'd be the same, essentially the same thing. You can also, we'll be going through SOQL and SOSL. I'll explain all those later on, but then that would be used with the query editor. And then you can also go to File, New, and this is where you can create different classes and triggers, which again, that we'll be going through later on. There is also within Trailhead, if you type in Developer Console, there is a module for the basics of Developer Console. This goes much more in depth into Developer Console. It has a bunch of cool things that you can actually use with it. So that goes much further into Developer Console than what I will be going through within this course. But if you wanted to get more information in regards to it, go to here within Trailhead. The rest of this is going to be going through setting up Visual Studio Code. And so if you wanted to do that and follow along, if you don't have Visual Studio Code already installed, you can search for Visual Studio Code or go to code.visualstudio.com and download Visual Studio Code. As you can see, I already have it downloaded. Once you get that downloaded, we are then, if you need a pause, then you can pause the video. But once you get it downloaded, we're going to be going to extensions, and we're going to be installing some extensions. So that is this icon right here for the extensions. And then if we search the marketplace for Salesforce, one of them that's going to be coming up is the Salesforce extension pack. This pack has several other extensions in it. It's more of a bundle of multiple extensions. We're going to be needing this. The other one that you can do is the Salesforce extension pack expanded. This one has additional extensions that we don't need, but if you wanted to install that one, go for it. Once we have the extensions all installed, we're going to want to be creating a project. Now the project is going to be used for us to be able to retrieve and deploy metadata into Salesforce. We're also going to be using it to create metadata within Visual Studio Code, and then it's also structures everything so that way we can kind of see when we're talking about more of how to be able to maintain the metadata, kind of the structure of what you would be using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be searching, and you can do Control-Shift-P. And what we're going to want is we're going to want to create a project. More than likely you won't have this coming up first. So if you type in SFDX, and then you could find create project with manifest, this is the one that we're going to want. So if you click on that, then you're going to start to create that project. Next thing that's going to pop up is it's going to ask you for whether or not you want standard, empty, or analytics. We'll just go with the standard, and then the project name. So whatever you want to name it. I'm going to name it Apex Tutorial. And then you select where you want that project to be, in which folder. So it could be anywhere, it could be on your desktop. I just put it into a specific folder that I have for this course. And then once that's created, then you'll see that this has the project created. And within the project, there's a couple of different folders. We're not going to go through all of them, but what they do is they're used for various purposes. The config, this one is used for creating your Scratch org and then having different Scratch orgs with different settings in there. The Force app folder has a main folder and then a default folder, and then a bunch of other metadata folders. This is what we're going to be primarily using, especially the classes and then triggers. And this is where you can create different classes and retrieve and upload metadata. The other thing that you can use is there's this manifest folder. The manifest folder, it has a package XML. This is also a different way that you can retrieve and deploy metadata from the package or from the project into Salesforce, or vice versa. And then there's a bunch of ignores and linting that we don't have to go through. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I need to authorize the org, so that way we have Visual Studio Code connected with our Salesforce org that we want to use. So what you may need to do is you may need to get the credentials for your org. In order to do that, you can go into your org and then settings. If you need to get your username or if you need your password, you can go and reset the password by going into, and we're just going to type up, the user comes up. You can click on change password for your user. One way to do that is by just typing into this search right here. You can go into users. And then go to your user that you created. It's going to be the one with the system admin profile. So once you do that, we're going to want to connect the org with Visual Studio Code. So what we're going to want to do now is create that as our default org. There's several different ways that we can do it. We can use the CLI, or right here in Visual Studio Code, we can click on to no default org set, and then click on authorize an org, create the project default, and then we're going to name it Apex Tutorial. And then you would be putting in your username and your password and logging in. And the first time that you do that, it's going to pop up and ask you if you want to allow the CLI. You're going to want to click on to allow. I already allowed it, so it's not going to ask me and prompt me to do that again. And now I can see right here, I am connected to Apex Tutorial, which is just the name that I named this org. The other way that you can do that is you can use the CLI. You can do sfdx force auth web login, and then Apex Tutorial, and then S. So what this does is this is a different way through the command line to be able to log into the org, name the alias Apex Tutorial, and then set it to default for this project. What I can also do now is I can do force org list, and I can see all the different orgs that I am connected to. If I had more orgs that I was connected to, I could see that, and then I could check the username for it. I could see the status of whether or not it's connected. And then also in here, I could change the org to a different org as well. There would be other names that come up. That way, then it's really easy for me to be able to change through different orgs, and I can retrieve metadata and I can deploy into those other orgs. This is used a lot with using different pipelines and being able to deploy from one sandbox to the next to then potentially production. Or if you just needed to create a different type of org, a scratch org, or just move metadata from one to another, this is a great way to do that as well. So now, next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go to File, and then Preferences, Settings, and then we're going to want to start typing in retrieve, and it's the retrieve test code coverage. So this more than likely is going to be unchecked. You're going to want to check it, and we're going to use this later on. So when we start talking about test classes and being able to see what lines of code we're testing against and has been tested, we can be able to do that with this setting. So now that we have that checked, next, I'm going to create a couple of different hotkeys. I've already done this, but I'm just going to go through how you would be able to create a couple of hotkeys to be able to run run a set of code anonymously through Visual Studio Code. What this is going to do is this is going to allow us, since we're connected with the org, to run some code or some lines of code within Visual Studio Code against the org. So that way we can then get an output of what that is going to be. I'll go through it a little bit more with the next couple of lessons as well, and you'll get much more familiar with it. Now if you highlight just any random text and then click on Control-Shift-P, what should come up is going to be this execute anonymous Apex with currently selected text. If it doesn't come up, if you just start to type in execute, it should come up, and then you click onto this gear. As you can see here, Shift-Alt-R is the hotkey that I already have bound to it. But then if you click on the gear, and then you double click, and then Shift-R, and then enter, that's going to bind Shift-Alt-R. So what this is going to do is any highlighted line of code that we have, it's going to execute it against the Salesforce org that we have that's connected to it. After we do that, we're going to want to go back to the highlighted section and then go back again to our search, Control-Shift-P, it's probably Command-Shift-P with the Mac. And then we want execute SOQL query with currently selected text. So kind of the same thing. We want to bind that. So that one we want Alt-Shift-Q. And then click Enter. So now if we have any SOQL that's highlighted and we do Alt-Shift-Q, that's going to run that against our org. So that way we can see what that query comes up with. Now that that's done, the last thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to install the CLI scanner. So as a prerequisite for the CLI scanner, and what the CLI scanner is going to do is we're going to be going over this later on, but that's going to be used to have an analysis or run an analysis against the code that we've created, and then it's going to try to find any bugs before we even deploy it into Salesforce. But first, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have Java installed, and it has to be Java 8 or higher version of the JDK installed. If you have that installed or you need some help getting that installed, what you can do is you can type in Salesforce Java setup, and it should come up with this developer Salesforce for Visual Studio Code getting started with Java setup, and that goes through different ways to download a Java JDK. After that's all installed, next what we're going to do is we're going to type in sfdx plugins install and then add Salesforce sfdx scanner. Okay, and this may take a little bit of time to run, so I'm going to just pause it until it's done running. All right, now that we have that installed, we can just type in sfdx scanner and help, just to make sure that everything is running properly, and it should come up with help commands. There we go. All right, now that that's done, that's the last piece of what we needed in order to set everything up within Visual Studio Code and to get everything connected with your org. And I'll see you in the next lesson.